Welcome. You're viewing a very special edition of the Now Awards. Normally, Kirsten Mann and I, hi Kirsten.
Hey Mark, how's it going? We're not together.
So normally Kirsten Mann and I turn around and we do this as a podcast, but today we've decided we're going to change to Plan B. And Plan B, I think, is what we're all in. And what we're doing is we're bringing in some of our fellow design executives, some awesome minds, to join us as we go talk about a collection of projects which are uniquely responding to the COVID-19 challenge. So Kirsten, I think you've got a couple of people you're going to help us introduce.
I do, and I think this is actually a very exciting situation, in the sense of horrible situation we're dealing with currently with the coronavirus and everything, but being able to connect with people globally this way is fantastic. And as you said, we've got some fantastic talent today. One of those people is Harriet. Now, Harriet, could we have a wave? And Harriet is actually the head of design or director of design for IAG, and you might have noticed is probably dealing with this situation in a completely different way than most people have to think of, because Harriet, you're in the final stages of chemotherapy.
Yeah, so the idea of innovation needed right now to help people with compromised immune systems is a design challenge that is absolutely real for myself and my family right now.
Yeah, and particularly you would be, if you go out and you get affected by this virus at the moment, it's a totally different world for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm one of those who's in total. I had a conversation with my son through the window yesterday while he came to pick up macaroni cheese from the doorstep.
Wow.
So then, Kirsten, who else have you got that you're going to be introducing? Is that Rod Farmer you've got there?
I've also got Rod. Now, Rod's the leader of design for APAC in McKinsey Digital. So he's really been working with multiple sectors to help enable different clients to be more design-centric as well. So
now,
welcome.
Is it McKinsey Digital? I think it's actually McKinsey Designs, because it goes much bigger than digital in there. So listeners or viewers, we're really doing this off the cuff here. So Rod, we'll pick you up in a few minutes. The next person I want to go introduce here is Mike Biggs. And Mike, he's the director or the lead of design and innovation at Telstra Purple. And he's joining us from Sydney. And then I'm also going to throw across that we've got Ronnie Peters, and Ronnie is coming to us via New York. Ronnie is actually the principal of 360 Design in New York, and he's been working on a range of genome projects with a team that links through to Harvard and MIT. We'll get into some more detail there. He's also the Chief Creative Officer for two awesome transport projects, which we'll dig into a little bit, which give you an idea of how rapid design is moving through things. But before we go much deeper into this, I think it's important that we remind everybody that the people who are here today are actually coming to talk to you with their expert minds on. They're not representing an organisation. They're not here for self-promotion. All we're trying to do is give you some of the bandwidth of our intelligence, our collective intelligence. And then what's going to be important there is, we know we don't have the ultimate list of projects. What we've got is some conversation starters. So Kirsten, why don't we head across to our first project that we're going to look at here, which is the Staying Connected with Our Children During a Pandemic campaign. I'm going to try to do some screen sharing so that we actually can get to go see that. This is from the Australian Childhood Foundation. And what's really interesting with this Australian Childhood Foundation project is that it turns around and it helps people who are with children who are feeling stressed and who are also not necessarily feeling comfortable, which is the remit for the Australian Childhood Foundation, to have a conversation piece with their children. And I think what I really like about this project is that they've turned around and they've taken their mission, which is to solve trauma in families with children, and they've worked out how to be responsive, and that they've worked out how to go give that an opportunity to get an airing there. How about for you, Kirsten? Did you see anything in this project that you said, we might have seen it before, or it's unique? What's come up for you?
I think what was great with these type of projects is always, there's, as we said before, there's no definitive answers with any of this, but sometimes, particularly with kids, it's like, what's the right wording? And way to approach these problems that doesn't totally freak them out and get them worried that the world is ending as well. So I thought this was quite, and again, we're always thinking about the cure or responding to the situation. There's been talk that you'll probably mention later, Mark, in relation to hospital bed initiatives and things like that. But, ultimately there's a lot of people, and specifically kids, who are trying to process this, and it's something that they've never encountered before in their lives. And how do we give them the language to deal? So this is where I thought it was another really interesting perspective of designing for people, and people include kids, right? And we often forget that.
Yeah, I was really blown away with Jacinta Ardern's simple four-stage chart that she held up in front of the population. Good old-fashioned, community communications. It gave people a framework. It gave them an opportunity to actually understand where they were up to and where they were going. We forget how important the communication layer is in many of these design projects. And so what I like about the Australian Childhood Foundation is they're doing their bit in their speciality to try to go and keep supporting in a change context. And that, I think, is a lot of what we've been seeing that's been coming up with these projects here. How about panel? Have we got anybody who wants to help us out with a little bit here, or do we move on to our next project?
I just wanted to add, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, Harry, how have you had this conversation with your family, and because your kids are pretty inquisitive, how have you kind of broached this whole situation?
Did you say to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my kids are older, but I think the thing that you've both touched on is simplicity. And, we're talking design about ruthlessly editing to the core of what needs to be done. And there's almost a trap we've fallen in over the last couple of years, that it has to be technological to be innovative or to be design based, and that there is something of real value around simplicity. So with my kids, they've gone off and researched themselves online, which means our conversations are a lot about what's fake and what's real. How can you validate information? But yeah, and I think there is something really necessary right now about simplicity.
Yeah, and I think that's right there, that we need to work out how to have clarity, simplicity, and it's important that we're actually giving a nod to the people who are continuing to go do their part. Because I think, Rod, one of the things that in our pre-conversation that we talked about is, are all of these projects that we're going to look at novel, or are they the best exemplar? And what I find really interesting is they're not going to be the best exemplar. We're trying to go give you some immediate response, some immediate insight to how people have been responding. We're not necessarily saying that they're the best of the best. What we're trying to do is say, here's timely information.
Can I add something there, panel? When we think about designing for accessibility and for inclusiveness, we think about the extremes, and generally speaking, it's good practice that those innovations will be good for the middle part of the curve as well. And I think about children in the same way. In this case, we communicate to other adults in this rational, functional way. This is what a exponential curve looks like, and blah, 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 just do the right thing. And it's a little bit too mechanical for me, I think. I really understand that information and I follow the rules and I'm staying home and all of that. But if we can learn about the feelings, the emotional side, the social aspects as the primary driver to the communication for children, how do we bring that back to the rest of the population? I think there's something to be learned there.
Yeah, and we do get, we know that we have to go deal with the different ways that people communicate, and kids, they're these lovely emotional beings, that they're not able to be rational, which is probably what's so great about them. Rod, I think you were about to jump in here.
Oh, sorry, Rod. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'll pause. You go.
Ronnie. Well, I was just going to mention about branding credibility, and we live in a world of so much misinformation, and there is so much around this topic right now, and it's really interesting to see how to communicate with kids and do it in a way that it is actually believable, and it becomes like an authoritative word and people will actually trust it. And I thought that comes across quite nicely with this, the way that it's actually put together.
Yeah. Over to you, Rod.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that one of the things that I think has to lie at the heart of design is that it's inherently people-centered, and it identifies a group, whether it's small or large, that has a very critical need that you can solve simply or otherwise through various design methods. And so when I look at this particular project, what I see is a very clearly identified audience that has a very specific need that you would not normally be able to solve through the rational approach. There's a lot more sort of emotional issues. There's some language issues. I might turn on my camera to kind of prove the point. Right, here we go. Let's see if my camera turns on. Is it working? It might not be.
Hang on, I'll come across to you. I'm going to get off the share here. Yeah, that's okay.
Let's
yeah,
see.
Your camera's working.
There we go. Right. So, so we actually ended up being locked down in an area where there was a huge spike of COVID in and around the preschool. So we actually picked up our family and came out here to the country, just so, and kind of explaining to what we had to do with different measures, why we couldn't see friends anymore, why we didn't have time to go to the playground, all of these sorts of things that you can try and solve for, really important, which is why I really liked this particular study. I'll turn off my my awful video camera here. And the other thing that I think we're talking a lot about the physical nature of and the economic nature of COVID, but one thing I did want to raise is that sort of third leg of the stool, which is around mental health, is really when we start to talk about looking after each other's well-being, not just on the physical side, but on the mental side, and helping our children or each other understand what we're going through is really important. So this is one of the ones that I actually really liked.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so what I find really interesting with that here is this is possibly one of the most the simplest projects if you went and looked at did they split the atom of design, but it's on target, it's on message, and it's delivering, and that is such an important thing at the moment. We've got such lack of clarity coming through from governments because they're trying to go do stage messaging. Could you imagine if the CEOs of the major companies in the world had to go and do a daily press conference, how they'd be seen to be wanting as well? This is very complex territory. I'm really glad to see that these guys have actually been able to put this together. What I'm going to do is pick up a little bit of pace here, and I'm going to have a look at a couple more projects, and we'll try to get through them, because I think when we get through the projects, we're then going to be able to actually have a much broader conversation here. And this project here, Trace Together. And so viewers, what we're going to do is I'm going to rush through the projects, then we've got all of them together. Okay. Trace Together is the government of Singapore, and they were trying to work out how did they put a tracing system that allowed people to know had they been exposed and then what they might need to do afterwards. It uses some simple technology, a Bluetooth sniffing. It's an app that they download on their phone. And when we get back to talking about this in more detail, we're going to go talk about the idea that this is what happens when you see a collective focused community rather than individual based community trying to go work out and co-support each other. The next project that we'll be talking about...
Maybe we'll just add there's obviously societal design implications with that one, right? So
we're going to come back to the reason I'm trying to get through and give you just an overview is because these all layer into each other. So yeah, don't worry, we're coming back to what that means from privacy, what it means from how will that data being used in the future. The next project that we're looking at here is AxiChain, and they've got this great mapping facility where they're able to work out where, in the way that the founder of the company talks, is where are the beefs in Australia for people who either need them for export or people who need them for abattoirs. How does this all fit together? And what's really interesting is that this project actually, it's a startup which is doing quite well in its market growth, but they got challenged when the bushfires went through Australia of how did they map where the beef supply was in Australia and how did they actually make that happen. They didn't have a mapping product. That was in February. They've now got a mapping product. We're at the end of March. It's very interesting to see that rapid innovation and how it's been ready for the next phase of our critical need. And I think, Rod, when we get to this, you're probably going to talk about some other projects that you've seen, because it's not necessarily unique, but what's interesting is it's been highly responsive. The next one we're going to go talk about is folding at home, and I'm an old geek, viewers, so I know about the SETI project where you gave some of your 386 processing cycles over to NASA so that they could turn around and work out was there extraterrestrial life. That then set up a whole range of projects that have followed since then. I know that there's a Vodafone initiative that uses your mobile phone processing cycles to go solve a bunch of medical issues. But this one's really interesting where they've turned around and they said, we want to go solve the drug problem of which drugs are going to deal with COVID-19. Now, that's actually a supercomputer simulation issue that's done now, and it's referred to as protein folding, hence the name of the project, which is called Folding at Home. We'll dig into that a little bit more in a moment. Probably the one that actually gave me the impetus to go do this was the Easy Breathe snorkeling mask. When I saw this project come through as a response to the issues of ventilators in Italy, it really made me realize that we need to have a conversation. And then just after that project came through, we then saw the team at ResMed had turned around and that they'd, I'm just trying to get here because it's hard to navigate. ResMed had turned around and that they'd come up with an adaptive ventilator project. We'll go look at that one. But the one that really blew me away was the Dyson ventilator that came through. And the Dyson ventilator is just this incredibly finished industrial design smart unit that's here. And I think that's actually, Rod, I'm going to refer to you to actually talk about, organizations at what stage of readiness are they? Because obviously Dyson, as a design-driven company, has been able to go change to work out how to solve these human problems, and that they've really shown us how that can work. We're also going to look at a 3D printing face shield project here, which it harks back to a project that we originally saw in 2015 called Enable, which was distributed 3D printing of prosthetics. And now you've got the fact that we've got architectural modeling studios and other 3D printing facilities around the world producing face masks for people with personal protective equipment in their local community. We've also got here the self-administration COVID-19 test so that you've actually got rapid testing. Because at the moment, the stage that we're up to is all about inrush. Where we're going to get to is that we have to then find out where is our herd immunity up to, who needs to be isolated, who actually can return to the population because they have antibodies. And we'll dig into that a little bit more, along with the point of care system that the team at Abbott have got. And this is really amazing. They've been able to go get a waiver from the FDA to bring in the testing here so that they can do it in ward, not have the 12-hour, 6 to 12-hour delay that happens when you have to take a sample to a lab inside a hospital. And then we're going to very briefly talk about a project that will be coming up very shortly, which is Bright Green and their germicidal lights to kill viruses. So I'm going to go all the way back now, Kirsten. Let's dig into Trace together because there's all sorts of societal issues here, aren't there?
And I imagine and I think Mike was touching on this before, like sometimes it's the rules of society change that allow innovation to take place. And we know that part of the greatest challenge faced with this is once somebody's been identified as having the virus, how do you find out all the people that they've been in touch with and contact to potentially test those as well? Now, it's interesting also in some of the Asian countries, particularly we saw some of the extreme measures being applied in China, where they've been able to really mandate some practices. And it actually has got some pretty impressive results from that as well. So there's definitely a fine line here with the need of being able to track and identify people, but is that actually an invasion of rights as well?
Well, so go on, please.
I'm just going to say, I think this is almost a broader question than this particular project, which is more about in the maturation of innovation. What we started off by seeing fragmented and disaggregated innovation. And what we're now tackling is, if we want to put in system-wide innovation, what is the point at which you relax regulation? But then even more importantly, how do you build new regulations as quickly as you build new products? And I think that is a really interesting question that some of these raise, because I think we saw Microsoft today pull out of an investment in Israeli face recognition technology, where they highlighted the absence of regulations around emerging tech. It's not for me as black and white as, and I know it's not for any of you either, but it's not as black and white as, do we break regulations to innovate? It's more, how do we ensure that regulation innovates at the same pace as product so that we can evolve society at a rapid rate? And I think that I find that fascinating about this one.
And Harry, what I find really interesting with the conversations with you is that with being involved with design at an insurance company, you have to go through and do a whole bunch of scenario planning, because your average day is working out, is it a full doomsday or is it a little doomsday, isn't it? So you know, that framing of what you're considering is very different than everyone else. And you also then have to work on, well, how do we innovate inside rules? Because eventually the things that you're involved with wind up in courtrooms, and courtrooms are decided on rules. So, you know, I think that's really interesting about here in Singapore, we've got a project which is trying to actually say, how do we help you after something is spreading, and how is that useful? The Australian government yesterday launched a similar app that gives people the opportunity to opt in. And I'd have to say, I opted in, and I'm giving them all of my mobile data so that they can work out the epidemiology for me, because at some point in the next 18 months, I'm going to have antibodies for it. Whether I've actually had full-blown COVID-19 with morbidity and a hospital presence, hopefully not mortality, but you know, it's like, I want to make that data of mine available. And so I find that scenario planning, laws, data sovereignty, we really don't have a mature way to talk about that, and we're finding that we're having to collide into that very quickly.
Can I say something there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I really like this project, and there are a couple of things here that I find really fascinating. I'm in New York City, and we're in an absolute shambles here and all levels. And if someone were to present this here as a solution for right now, I'd be all over it. And like you, Mark, I'd readily give my identity up, and I'd go along with this. And I think one of the questions to me is like, well, when do you turn that off? It's easy to turn this on. It's easy to escalate this. But then at what point, as this pandemic actually does die down, because it will eventually, do you actually dial back and say, okay, that's enough now, and it doesn't now become a new norm and then get used for other purposes? Right?
I find that fascinating, Ronnie. I think that's exactly the point, is that a dictatorship says we use the opportunity of the constraint to change the law forever. A democracy, or a new type of normal that's designed for a society like this, puts limits and regulations on there. And I absolutely am with you 100% on, that's the conversation I feel like we should be having now as these laws get changed rapidly.
But I suppose with that, we saw when the laws that came in after 9/11 were created, that we're now 19 years past that, and we've still got laws that probably should have had a sunset of about 9 months, and they're still in place. And so that's really interesting, that when it comes to the idea of military security and border protection, homeland security, whichever name you want to go give it, we haven't sunsetted those things. But when it comes to personal privacy, we're saying maybe there should be. So we're not elegant in how do we solve that and how do we have that conversation. I have been impressed over the last number of years of the work that the UK government has done to make sure that data in their gov.uk site, that people understand the remit of their information and what's going on there. And we saw Europe try to go tackle this with their privacy legislation, but then we realized that maybe the software of society is actually a little broken, because we were then winding up in each jurisdiction had to have a different privacy or data protection legislation. And what we're seeing with the pandemic is we now live in a global economy that has nation states, and people are interacting as if they're global citizens, not necessarily citizens of a city, except in the case of New York, we're finding you're really getting hyper-local, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's keep moving on here, and I want to go and have a look at AxiChain a bit here. Who thinks that AxiChain has actually solved something which you can say this is really timely and useful, or who actually wants to just say, oh, look, I think this is a same as. I think it's fantastic what they've been able to do in a rapid time.
I I find this one really, really interesting. I think we have seen that agriculture in particular is really having to adapt both to climate change, changing natures of distribution, the changing diets that we have. And I think this one is more like, I think we get stuck in radical or incremental innovation, or, you know, exactive and adaptive information and innovation. I think this one is solving a problem right now by pulling together a range of different technologies to provide a disaggregated market at a time that we need it most. So for me, food security in a time of global change, whether it's pandemic or climate change, is really important. And the way that this deals with, we've seen the global supply chain collapse very, very fast. And the need for us to redesign global supply chains and potentially leave large chunks out of it, like sale yards in the case of this particular innovation, I find fascinating. Like, what will be the points of the trade and global trade network that will drop out, as well as what will be reinvented?
And I think what's going to be really interesting there is that for this area, in their traditional business model, they always thought they had to go and have the sale yard. And there's been people who say, well, maybe we can trade these commodities without a sale yard. And now they're finding out, well, they can trade them. Will they ever return back to the sale yards? You know, that's going to be interesting to go see how fast people go in. And we've seen that. I remember for the very early phases of digital transformation, which people, they seem to go full, we're going digital. Then there was a middle management rebellion into that. So then they actually went back to some paper and traditional communications and processing. And then another wave came that they actually said, well, let's go and actually push the digital transformation again. We've seen this happen many times. So hopefully what we get out of this is actually maybe back to plan A plus, not just back to plan A.
I think we've seen some of this in local, sorry, because I'm a quick bit, but like some of the localized food delivery, we've seen the abandonment of things like Uber Eats in favor of people supporting, you know, my local cafe is delivering grocery boxes, my local bookshop is on the way home throwing packaged books over the fence without delivery charge. And we're seeing these inventive ways of distributing products at a much more localized level. I know this one's not localized, but I think this idea of distribution networks being the next point of really massive transformation makes me excited about this one.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to see, you know, I'm predicting it's between 3 to 5 weeks that there will be a massive drop off in cafes and restaurants deciding to use Uber Eats, because at 30% taxation on their revenue, they can't keep their businesses open. You know, when it was part of their trade, it was okay. When it's 100% of your trade, it's now more expensive to be with Uber Eats than paying taxation in your country. So that's going to be a really interesting transformation there. Kirsten, you wanted to chip in here.
I was just going to say that I think it was another great example of adaptive design, and even what Harriet just was just highlighting there, where sometimes the intent of a design is in one path, and then situations and contexts happen that completely change that direction as well. And I think we'll see with these type of providers that they're responding to what the environment is giving them and saying, okay, how can we kind of adapt this solution to something else? And I think we'll see that with a lot of the projects that we're going to go through as well. They're beautiful examples of design isn't just this, hey, let's create this beautiful product, and sure, it's got an aesthetic aspect to it and pleasurable and all the rest of it, but ultimately it's about solving problems. And that's what these guys are doing.
So I've put us across into gallery views so that we're all on now. So just remember, you know, not to touch your face because of this COVID-19 period. Let's keep moving along here, and we're going to go have a talk about the folding at home. Who's got a unlimited data capacity on their internet connection, and who's got a machine that they can actually put to this cause? I know I have. I'm definitely going and doing it. I think Mike, you turned around and showed that you're involved with SETI. I think Harriet, you said that as well. Ronnie, I'd be surprised if you weren't. I think Rod, there's a bit of geek that goes a long way back in you, so you probably did it. You know, the idea that we can all go and actually contribute our resources. And I was even talking to somebody yesterday about all of these offices that have desktop computers that are sitting there. When is the IT department going to wake the machines up and say, let's give it to folding at home? Because there's a lot of processing power that could be dedicated. am I going to get anything?
No, I would just like to say I think this is fascinating, and actually this is the first time I've heard of this particular project, and I think one of the challenges here is how do we get the word out to people, because I think there are a lot of folks who would love to participate in this and would be a part of this, because it's literally could be little to no cost at all for a lot of people to actually join in. So how does this crisis, how do we actually fast forward and get the word out as quickly as possible to as many people so they know where they can actually participate?
Yeah, and so I think that's a really important thing. How do we share? You know, I know with the Design Executive Club feed that we've got on LinkedIn, you know, I'm concerned, are we oversharing projects? Are we undersharing? You know, what's the right calibration here of actually trying to send information out? My dear friend and colleague, Mauro Pacini at Pepsi, Mauro's, he's just this vivacious creator as the chief design officer at PepsiCo. But he's in the Hamptons, and he's like a volcano that is just spreading out so much material. It's almost the point that it's a little bit of overload there. And you go, well, how do you curate that? That to me is a really interesting thing. Where do you actually make sure that there's special messages that go out so people know to pay attention? Or do you go down the fire hose path that Mara is doing, which is the messages are going to land with people. I just need to keep putting it out. They're difficult calls, aren't they?
I think we can learn a lot from cat videos around this one. I think the things people spread tend to be the things they find fascinating. You know, I look at my shift in social media, and it's changed exponentially over the last couple of weeks from being very much to WhatsApp groups to groups of people with whom I need to or want to communicate, and with them we're sharing things that we find fascinating. So it's almost again like a more localized big network, and I wonder whether people will, I mean, like me, I'm going to go and share this straight away because I find it fascinating. And I wonder whether our networks will reshare. There's that bit now where we've reached where you say, have you seen that video of, and everyone laughs and says, oh my God, yes. And I think we're finally seeing a move away from self-promotion in social media to actually social media as channels of shared need.
Yep. It's almost like we've been on a training course with social media, which is, it was nice but not useful, and now we're finding out how to go use this useful tool and work out the sharing and how that happens, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to keep moving along. I'm going to go to Easy Breathe. Now, does anybody remember the first time that they went and saw the Easy Breathe project? And do you remember what your emotion was when you saw it?
Gee, that's an ugly looking thing.
Yeah, I had the same reaction.
But
hang on. I look at that video, the picture that you're getting now, which is if you're in that state and you've got people with the gloves and you've got a drip in your arm, you don't care how you're looking. You know, I think that's the important thing. Yeah. So
that line with, would you wear that on the street versus, and it is, it's this kind of, because people, it's really, it becomes this line of where, you know, how do I look and all of those kind of things that people weigh into. And there was this great, I'll share it in a moment, with what are the psychological waves that people go through when there's a pandemic. And, you know, initially, and you could see this, people refuse to wear masks in the street now, right? And now you see masks everywhere, and but they're stylish masks as well. Some people have, you know, glittered and all the rest of it on their masks. This would be one of those ones, I think, a lot of people, you know, fantastic adaptive design again, but you know, it might have to be in a life-threatening situation before they'd walk down the street with this one.
No, the framing's wrong. No, I look at it and I think it's a fantastic thing. I think it looks, okay, don't compare it to walking down the street in your normal clothes, right? Think about it as it's that or the other ventilator, right? This is the cool one. It looks fantastic, and it's saying, hey, we're all a community, we're working together. It's a marvel of local engineering. I don't think there's anything bad about the thing. It's just amazing. It's a badge. I think
we have to look at it from the perspective of doctors and nurses as well, because I mean, I think it's doctors and nurses and the people needing the ventilator. It's like if you are in northern Italy right now and you're a doctor or a nurse and you've got a choice of ventilator or no ventilator, and this comes up, I think you're going to be like hugely
absolutely
grateful.
If you're here to save my life with this device, I am all for it. Yeah, which I think is really interesting there. So I'm going to then go over to the next project that we're looking here is the ResMed ventilator system, and you know, this is a bit like the Olympics with Olympic diving. We now all know a lot more about ventilators than we did 2 weeks ago. Yeah? And I suppose what we're finding is that the difference between the China, which is around about 4% in Wuhan district as mortality for detected cases, and then and Italy, where they're up at 11%, is the availability of these ventilators and ICU beds. And that's a really interesting thing. Who would have thought that, you know, the idea of making sure that we're able to open people's airways, that we can go give them really good quality air, is going to be a life or death circumstance. I don't think anybody did, because I've seen in the UK that you've got Ford are now part of producing 30,000 ventilators as part of a government initiative there. You've got GM, Tesla, everybody seems to be saying, how do we go help manufacture the parts for this? And what I really like about the ResMed is they're a medical technology company. They have great products, but they've worked out how to take some of their existing products and then adapt them so that they can meet this new need. It's not the original need that they had, but it's that adaptive side. And that's very similar to the previous project, which was actually done by some design interventionist people who were taking a standard product off the shelf. It wasn't Decathlon who make the mask who actually turned around and initiated the project. It was the local doctors who came up with the Venturi valve and worked out how to modify them. So then that then leaves us to another project in here, which is the Dyson. And to me, out of our ventilator products, this one is probably the one where we see this shows the applied design, the design literacy or design capacity of the organisation is phenomenal. If you can turn around and you can complete a product that has the industrial design capacity of this, that has the user interface that they've got on here, and that you can use your existing motor technology so that you can have a battery-powered ventilator that sits on the side of a bed, you're showing that you've actually got a capacity to respond to the market, which is second to none. And you know, I think when I look through all of the projects here, the one that shows to me that they are driven by design and that they know how to be adaptive to me is this project from Dyson. It really stands out. What I find interesting about that is that I would never have thought Dyson and ventilators, but it's not hard to imagine battery-powered motors that pump air, but we're used to them pumping air to either dry our hair, dry our hands, or to go vacuum something up. You know, that adaptation there from an engineering perspective is very interesting. No doubt this thing is actually also quite quiet, which is necessary in a medical circumstance. Any panelists who've got some thoughts about the Dyson project?
I was just going to say, I think this is the return of expertise. I think we've kind of come out of this era of anybody can do anything, and it's been a problem for all of our industries, and particularly innovation and design. This space shows that expertise, whether it's engineering expertise or design expertise or tooling and machine expertise, is really, really important, particularly if you want to innovate quickly. And I wonder whether it's the beginning of a move back and a backlash against non-expertise towards one where we really value expertise again.
And Harriet, I remember a story that you told me about IAG Group and design thinking being spread across the organisation, and that then I think it was one of your actuaries who told you a tale, which is, I'm a really good actuary, and I'm not expecting the designers to be an actuary. I'm expecting the designers to be designers, and I need to know how to interface with them. And that's where I think this expertise comes. There's some really good mechanical engineering that's in here. There's obviously scientific understanding about airflow. There's design understanding. It's actually, they've got the whole stack. And I think that's important if we're trying to go solve it, whether it's the interface design on the front, whether it's the couplings that are on there, whether it's the fan or the motor noise that's in there. It all comes down to expertise. And that's what I think we see when you get a very broad base rather than having a very narrow focused organisation that has only an innovation team. Well, I'm going to head across to our 3D printed face masks here. The face shields that we're seeing here, I talked before that they go back to a project that we originally saw in 2015, which was 3D printing of prosthetic arms. The name of the project was Enable. And what was interesting was within 6 months, we found that every major corporation in the US now was doing a project that was about 3D printing prosthetics for kids. And that was a fascinating movement that took place. What I'm seeing within 6 days is that you've now got 3D printed face shields that are coming out. And so this design of this project here that comes from Prusa 3D is one of them. And I've seen both Foster and Partners, I've seen Barker Ingalls Group, the architectural companies, that they're using their 3D printers in their model labs to produce 1,000 of these masks for their local hospital in Brooklyn who needs personal protective equipment. And that idea that we can adapt, whether it's the computers that are in our office to go do some folding of proteins, or whether we can go use our 3D printers that aren't working to go actually solve this challenge, is a really interesting process. And one of the reasons why we need to keep organizations operating. You know, the idea that we're shutting down our economy and going on a holiday, I think most of us realize that's not the case. We seem to all be sitting in Zoom rooms like we are at the moment, and we're working out how to keep doing business as usual. Has anybody else seen some 3D printing projects that have amazed them? No.
Nothing to do with this.
Yeah, about other examples, but I think I love this project because again, it comes back to, we keep mentioning the theme of adaptive, but it's also reuse, right? Like it's basically, we talk about that a lot of these pieces are in place with technology and often it requires just a different assembly of them and a different design thinking approach to it. And what these guys have done, and you kind of mentioned right at the beginning, Mark, there, the time frame. Design's often seen as this bloated, has to, you know, people go off in their black skivvies and their dark glasses and they think of these things, right? These guys have turned this around within 6 days, I think it was, and are really helping solve a really key problem. So I love this project. I thought it was simple. It was, again, adaptive, but it was showing how quickly design can actually solve a need.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're seeing here on all of these projects is how fast can design solve a need. And in this case here, it's actually timeliness is more important than perfection. And, you know, we've been trying to get that message across when it's come to design projects in organizations. I think we now have a lot of examples of how we've been able to go and satisfy the need quickly. And no doubt the 3D models that came with this, the first ones actually weren't perfect, but because they're digital files, they would have been redistributed. People might have even taken them and actually made their own version of the modeling to go and enhance from there. It really is impressive how people are able to work on things. So now we're going to go and have a look at the idea of a self-administered COVID.
I might hold you there for a second. I think
please.
I think Ronnie had a point there too.
Oh, please, Ronnie.
He's been very politely waiting.
No, I was just backing up. I like the fact that you put this next to the Dyson because a ventilator is a very complex piece of machinery that is very precision and has to work incredibly properly, right? And the face mask, the face shield, as you pointed out, it's open source. There are so many organizations out there that have 3D printers, and knowing about this, realizing I could contribute as an organization because I have a whole stash of 3D printers. I think that's just fabulous. You know, everyone out there in their own way can play a role. Anyone who's got a computer can use folding a card, right? So there are all these like ways that people can contribute.
So I'm going to move across then to the self-administered COVID-19 test here by the United Health Group. This project is really interesting when we go past the inrush curve that we're going up at the moment. But something that we need to know is who actually has the antibodies for COVID-19. And for listeners, if you're not familiar with that, we can't stop this virus. All we can do is manage the pace that we wind up getting antibodies. And unfortunately, when people get antibodies, some people get very unwell, which is what we refer to as morbidity, how you know, taken out of the project are they? And then we also get mortality. But we know that for the majority of people, if the mortality rate sits somewhere between 2% and 10%, that Other people, so 98% of the population or 90% of the population, are going to be 18 months down the track that they'll have antibodies. We need to know how to get people back to work, and we need to know in a way who is safe to interact with people who are recently infected. At the moment, nobody's safe, but give us a month, give us 6 months, give us 12 months, we're going to find that that population of people who can safely interact with somebody who has COVID-19 increases. So then the idea of being able to go do, similar to a pregnancy test, go and do a self-test is all important, because we want to know which part of the world that we're in. I know in Iceland, they've turned around and they've had very high testing in their population, a country of only 360,000 people. And what they found was that out of those 360,000 people, 50% of the people who tested positive weren't showing any symptoms at all. And so in Australia, in the US and the UK, because of the number of tests that are available, they're limiting the scope of that testing. That's going to expand out, and it's going to be tests like the self-administered COVID-19 test, which is actually going to be the way that that happens. Panel, who wants to actually talk about this?
How far away do we see this from being available, Mark?
So this one here is actually that they've turned around, and it's not just this organisation. I've seen 3 other tests that have come from, there's a CellMid, a company in Queensland who's got a self-administered test, and they'll go into the market very quickly because these sorts of tests fit under different regulatory requirements as against laboratory tests, so the next project that we look at. And so it's the idea of a pregnancy test is an indicator, it's not actually guaranteed. And so you'd find it's a little bit like using your Fitbit to go tell you about your activity level. It's not actually what you'd have in a full clinical circumstance. So we've got a wellbeing tool rather than actually a clinical tool. And this one kind of sits right on the edge of that. I wouldn't be surprised to see this in the market, imminently in the market, if not already in the market. So that brings me then, I'm going to move to the next project, because this one we know actually is in the market. And this project is really interesting because it's actually from one of the biggest testing and diagnostic companies in the world, Abbott. It relies on a machine that they released about 2 years ago, and it's about the size of a toaster. And so it can fit in a medical ward. And what happens when somebody goes and takes some fluids from somebody to be tested? They then have to be physically moved either to a lab inside the hospital or outside the hospital. And if you think of our surge and overflow hospitals, they're not going to have labs that are close by. So you've probably got a 6 to 12, if not 24-hour delay just getting the sample from the ward down to be tested. This allows the test to take place at point of care. And because it's been done at point of care, it means that in less than 15 minutes, they've got a response. And this, Kirsten, this form of testing is what doctors will rely on. This will tell somebody that I can now free up your bed and send you home, get on with your life, and that they're out of the bed a day earlier. Now, when we're looking and counting beds of how many beds we've got, getting somebody out of a bed a day early because you can get the test done is a phenomenal efficiency, as well as the fact that it's going to bring peace of mind to people's families a lot quicker. So I find this project here from Abbott as one of the really interesting projects here, because it turns around and it shows that Abbott had a system in place. They obviously had a test that was very close, that they were able to adapt, but they also had the relationship with the FDA to turn around and go get a rapid approval of this. And that again is that's that whole stack thing that we were talking about, a little bit like Dyson. They've got momentum, they've got expertise, and they were able to apply it to solve this problem. So I'm getting quiet here. Listeners, if you're watching this shows you how unrehearsed we are, which in a way is really nice, because it gives you an idea this isn't a slick thing we're doing. We're just trying to go out and help as much as we can here. So
I'll jump in.
Help me out, Rod.
I'm not going to talk about this project. I'll make a separate comment about all the projects. What I see reading between the lines out of all of this that really impresses me, which is something that I think should be considered and adopted within most organizations, is I think what Kirsten's calling adaptivity and that responsiveness. And the question is, why aren't organizations as adaptive and responsive usually, as we're finding them to be right now, or in these instances, how they are right now. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there's, one of three reasons. There's either a lack of clarity around the vision and purposefulness. There's a lack of an engine to be able to design and innovate or re-engineer quickly and seamlessly. Or there's a lack of the required foundations, whether they be technical or human. So, talent, processes, people, etc. They're the big three things, the most, typically the roadblocks or the stumbling blocks for companies being more agile or responsive. And what I like about all of these is they have all three things being hit. One, the COVID-19 response has been to focus. It's been to get very clear about what you're trying to solve, the need to solve it. What are the key things that you have as your attributes, your enablers, whatever you want to call them? What are the things that you possess that you can leverage very, very quickly in the servitude of that purpose or that vision? And that you execute very nimbly with the people around you to get something out the door. Now, if you look at Dyson, it proves that they had all the enablers in the world. They had all the talent, all the technical skills. For them to be able to turn this around in 10 days shows a very clear clarity of vision, purposefulness, and being able to, what I think Harry referred to earlier, was to be able to simplify, which for me, I'd say is also to radically focus. If I have a look at the 3D printed mask, it's the same with the skills and attributes that we have. How can we radically focus on a very clear problem? So if I step back from all of these, the thing that I like about all of them is that they're outcome back. They're about the outcome, and it shows how companies and people can rapidly rally around a shared purpose that is outcome led, rather than what most organizations suffer from, which is being a little bit functionally led, which leads to all the classic problems of working in silos, talking too much about methodologies and not about outcomes, or far too much measurement of things that really don't matter. And at the same time, lacking a very clear clarion call across the organization about why you exist and how it is that you want to serve your customers. So trying not to talk about any specifics of the individual projects, every single one of them kind of exhibits those sort of traits that I think we could all adopt. All Australian and Asian organizations could adopt that degree of agility and responsiveness and purposefulness if they start to look at those key things. What are we really trying to solve, and can we be laser focused on that? What are the key things that we're great at, and where could we push them a little bit better to be great? And how can we really start to work with a sense of urgency around those more nimble agile teams to get stuff out the door and test and learn, rather than working in big, much larger monolithic structures. And that's what really excites me about the whole portfolio of these ideas.
So Rod, I 100% agree with you. The interesting thing though is we're seeing this happen because there's a need to change and respond very quickly, right? And that's human life at this point. And I suppose the question there is, how do you get organizations to stay in this state of, because, we see amazing things happen when there's this drive and this need, but often it's just complacency, right? People really, a lot of these organizations, they don't get that because they're not being forced, or they're not being put in this state. And so that's the other interesting part. I think exactly what you're saying with getting those organisations to be able to respond and learn and everything. But the key thing for change to happen is there has to be that impetus or something that makes it and forces it. And how do we kind of do that in everyday life is the other side of I've been kind of thinking a lot about.
So what I'd like to do here, and thank you, Rod and Kirsten, as closing comments, it would be wrong to try to actually choose a project here. I think for all of us, we've got ones that resonate with us. So I'm just going to go through the rest of the panel here. Harry, you've got a project that I saw the smile that came on your face when you looked at the Axie chain, solving this, commodities, the supply chain there. Are there any summary comments like Rod that you've got? And then we can begin to wrap up everybody.
Yeah, for me, they're the very opposite of innovation as novelty. They are, and Rod mentioned distinctive competencies, or what are we good at? I think in all of these, the technologies themselves have been evolving for some time. the integration of these technologies to rapidly be applied to a problem gives opportunity for everybody. And we've sort of, it feels to me like we're emerging from a place where ideas are competing for the value of the idea itself, to how well do the distinctive competencies of an organization get compiled rapidly when focused in a laser sharp way to help us do things differently immediately. And I think if we look at all of these projects, we see distinctive competencies, very different distinctive competencies being applied rapidly to that focused piece. I think that's what's exciting for me, that we will see a real evolution of the systems that we use for work, for moving goods, and for sheltering, for some of the basic and fundamental needs we have. And I agree that they're all there. The agri one for me is really interesting because it solves a problem right now that will help people with income, with distribution, and also utilizes a lot of emerging technology in really useful and applied ways.
Yeah, fantastic. And Mike, how about for you? Was there one that stood out for you?
No, I'm just going to be like everyone else and talk about the themes. I noted down a bunch of things. A lot of the solutions existed. I think that's a common theme. The bricolage that everyone's talking about, putting together the things that already exist in a new way. They're not sexy or remarkable in some respects as solutions, but their application is. The thing that's most important to me, and the localized thing, which I think is great. I'd love to come back in a separate session and talk about Paris being a 15-minute city, but I'm not going to do that now. And that was your point, Mark, which we can go on another time. The most important thing was we're free to do what's right, is what I wrote down here. And I thought it's really interesting that the laser sharp focus and vision that's required is true. That is true in organizations. But in this case, we're honing in on a collective thing that exists above and beyond individual organizations. And so why is it that now, as individuals, organizations, networks, ecosystems, we're all sort of have the permission, either personally or collectively, to do what's right? And I think that's the key in the day-to-day. How do we maintain the permission to then focus on these things that are true and right and good and beyond ourselves? Otherwise, we can slip back into, you know, shareholder value or something like that. I'm interested in how boards are thinking right now about how do we, why are boards saying it's okay to do what's right now, but not other times?
Look, Mike, we're going to go and we'll have we'll dig into that in another session, a set of sessions that we're doing, which is the Design Exec Club are doing a bunch of town halls in Australia, in the UK, in Asia, and in the US. And I think that's actually where we'll pick that conversation up there. So we'll take that on board there. Ronnie, how about for you? The themes or a particular project? What really stood out?
I'm in agreement with everything everyone said, and I think the three for me were the trace together, the folding at home, and the 3D printed mask. I thought, you know, all stood out. I'm also really curious and interested what happens next. I think this idea that we've made a lot of changes, some that are for the moment, and how do we dial those back? How do we learn from here and go forward? And what's happening now again? That we can say this is really good what's happened from this, and keep this going. The sky outside is so clear in New York City, it's unbelievable. I didn't realize how polluted this city is until there's no traffic on the roads. I can hear birds chirping when I go outside. I've got a picture of Venice behind me. Apparently the water is so clear you can see the bottom of the canal right now. You know, anyway, yeah.
Fantastic. Kirsten, in closing?
Look, I think it's what's really interesting about the projects we've seen is how broad design is and the problems that it can tackle and face. And often people do think about the reactionary things, like how are we going to get enough masks? How are we going to get enough beds? How are we going to get enough respirators? But you can kind of see that. I think what's great about this is it's really the need to think across those experiences. And there's so many of these touch points that we've looked at today, and even sustaining the economy with the agricultural example. Like, we're going to get to a point where people have been kept inside and haven't been producing food that sustains the rest of the economy. So, you know, it's really thinking how we have to think end to end with these problems. And I think, Mike, you've kind of, the projects that you've collected have shown that it is a broad spectrum of design that we're looking at today.
Fantastic. And everybody, you know, to my panel here, thank you for giving your time and your minds to go have a look at this. For the viewers, we didn't know where we were going to go with this. This was actually us stumbling through it. So thank you for helping us. I actually feel like we got a little bit slick in the last 5 minutes. So, but the rest of it was really great content that was there. I think we're going to try to do another one of these in a month's time, because COVID-19 isn't over. The responses aren't over. Panel, thank you for your time. Viewers, thank you. Please share this. This is about knowledge, which we're trying to make sure that people who are driven by design have resources and they understand how to actually accelerate their future. To all the project creators, thank you very much. And I think that's a sign off for us. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Nice.